Detroit is officially bankrupt. What will this mean for city retirees? What assets are on the table? And what will the city look like in a year? Join us right now for MiWeek.
Michigan's turnaround is being powered by things we do better than anywhere else in the world. Today's global leaders routinely turn to Michigan to work on their most difficult problems. That's because the engineering talent in this part of the world is simply the best. So many possibilities lie ahead for Michigan's future. These opportunities are here and starting to happen. The vision for the new Michigan. Share it, talk it up, drive it home. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Good evening, and thanks so much for joining us for MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. It is the story making headlines around the world. Detroit is bankrupt. The judge ruled this week the city is eligible for bankruptcy protection. And in a surprise move, the judge addressed the question of pensions. He said they're like any other contract in bankruptcy court that can be restructured. Now it's all in Detroit Emergency Manager Kevin Orr's hands, along with a team of lawyers, to craft a plan for financial reorganization. It's never been done before in a city this size.
We have a lot of work ahead of us, and what I would ask both our creditors, none of whom, by the way, filed an objection to our eligibility, but equally important, our labor partners, to come forward with us and to take this opportunity, even in the process of litigation and appeals, to try to get at the sorely needed reform that this city has got to achieve so we can move forward into a new day. And we can prepare, hopefully, a consensual plan of adjustment and be able to remove the receivership over the city so that it can grow and thrive.
The governor also released a statement the day of the ruling. He said today the federal court allowed Detroit to stay on the path toward a brighter future, a future where streetlights work and ambulances respond quickly, a future where crime and blight shrink and where jobs and investments surge. Authorizing the emergency manager to seek federal bankruptcy protection was a difficult decision, but it was the last viable option to restore the city and to provide Detroit's 700,000 residents with the public services they need and they deserve. Judge Rhodes' ruling today affirms that decision. We are talking bankruptcy tonight, the process, what negotiations are happening right now, what will happen to art at the DIA, how much will retirees lose, and the big picture, what does this mean for Detroiters, improvement of daily services, and the future of city leadership? What affects the largest city in our state affects all of us. Joining me right now are MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's good to see you.
Good to be here.
I feel this last year has been a year of milestones. We keep talking about this is a huge day for Detroit when there was a consent agreement. This is a huge day for Detroit when they appoint an emergency manager and the filing for bankruptcy in July. And now finally we have this next milestone. It wasn't a surprise what Judge Rhodes' ruling was this week.
No, I think everybody assumed that Detroit was, if any place was eligible for bankruptcy, Detroit was. The judge pretty well said it should have been in bankruptcy years ago.
Yeah, that's what struck me. He said Detroit could have and should have filed years ago.
I said if they had, they would be, of course, a lot better shape. And one of the points he made was that if they had just simply stopped borrowing to pay today's bills, in other words, stopped borrowing to pay operating costs, their debt would be very minimal today, $700 million, and this would have been necessary. But Detroit just kept borrowing from tomorrow to pay today's bills, and now tomorrow's gone. What
did you see in the ruling, Stephen? Judge Rhodes was very deliberate, and he spoke for about an hour and a half when he gave his ruling.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he made clear this is a very straight-laced, rule of law judge who was not going to let the emotions of this issue into the ruling and into his courtroom. I mean, he made very clear that the finances are what they are and that there's no way to really argue about them. I mean, it amazes me the number of people who still want to argue about whether we owe $18.5 billion or whether it's $12 billion or whether it's $6 billion.
What does it matter?
What does it matter?
It's still billion with a B.
Right. We don't have any of it. We don't have a dollar. I mean, as the judge pointed out, they were about to run out of money. when they filed for bankruptcy. So, I mean, I think he did a very good job of eliminating all of that stuff, all of this sort of white noise that has surrounded this, that's emotional and political, and said, these are the facts on the ground. And if any city qualifies for Chapter 9 protection, Detroit is at the front of that line.
And, you know, everyone had said, well, this is a sad day for Detroit, a tragic day for Detroit. And it is that, but it's also a very hopeful day for Detroit, because if it can get out from under 2/3 of that debt or more, it has a chance to build a viable city for the long term. There's no way it could keep paying 40% of its revenues out in debt service and still provide the sort of city services a city needs to keep and attract residents.
Yeah. And one thing that people forget is that Chapter 9, which protects government entities, is very different from Chapter 7 or 11, in which private or public corporations can essentially be stripped clean, and there's no provision that says they have to even survive the process, right?
And often don't.
And often don't.
But this city has to survive the process.
Chapter 9 says the process is supposed to be designed to make sure that you have a viable city when you come out on the other side. There's an enormous amount of protection for the city in this process.
It really is slanted toward the city and away from the creditors, which is a reverse of private sector bankruptcy. But, you know, we saw this week the unions protesting out in front of the building. You can't blame them. They're going to be asked to take the biggest hit here. But you also saw folks carrying signs, you know, hurt the banks, not us. Well, people are missing the point here. The banks are getting hurt big time here. The banks are going to walk away with 10 cents on the dollar or less. I don't know how you hurt them much more than that.
Yeah, but for people, you can't put a face on a bank, and you can put a face on all this retirees. So let's talk about...
But you can't pretend also that there's someplace else to get the money, because the banks are giving up most of their debt. Even if they gave up 100% of what Detroit owes them, Detroit would still be insolvent. It wouldn't be enough to spare the other cuts that are necessary.
Let's talk about the question of pensions and the fact that the judge said they are contracts, just like any other contract that can be restructured in bankruptcy court, regardless of what the state constitution says. Were you, did that come a little bit as a surprise to you that he addressed this so early on in the process before even any kind of restructuring plan was filed? He could have waited, but he said it directly out in this decision.
Well, it was unexpected. I thought he was going to deal with that later, but it was a very smart move on his part to settle that now, to settle everything at once, to get all of the appeals going at the same time, to expedite this process. The last thing anybody wants is for this to drag out for 2, 3, 4 years.
It's federal bankruptcy court, but is it fair? We still have something in the state constitution which says that these pensions...
Well, I mean, what Judge Rhodes said is that in terms of federal law, the state constitution doesn't hold sway. The bankruptcy code is the supreme law of the land on this matter. But that does not mean, for instance, that there aren't obligations that have to be met, and that the state courts, for example, can enforce those obligations against the governor and the legislature. You've got this opinion by Bill Schuette, our Attorney General, saying this provision matters, and this is a very important point. You know, when we start picking and choosing which parts of the Constitution we're going to honor or dishonor, then we become a nation of men and not laws. This is a nation of laws, and yes, federal courts hold sway over state provisions in terms of federal court, but that does not apply across the board at the state level.
Well,
you agree with this?
Well, not entirely. You can't build into your Constitution runarounds of federal law. You can't shield yourself from federal law by just writing things into your state constitution. What the judge said was the state Supreme Court hasn't ruled on this.
Right.
And he tried to anticipate how the state Supreme Court would rule, and he felt they would rule this way. Now, what may happen here, and the judge hinted at it a little bit, if he wipes this debt away for Detroit, if he cleanses them of this responsibility, it doesn't mean the state constitution might not kick in to transfer that obligation to the state. So that the state has to pick up ththese constitutionally guaranteed pension obligations, and that would be
that's what our state constitution says.
That would be a tremendous shift and a tremendous development in this state, because you have a lot of other communities who would like to do the same thing.
Yeah, I'm sure you have cities around the country who are watching this happen
that's
right now.
And that's the precedent-setting piece of this. How much of state law can be undone in a federal bankruptcy court when it comes to municipal bankruptcies.
All right, so let's talk about some of these retirees, many of whom were very disappointed, obviously, but also shocked that this decision was made. Were they living in denial that this was a possibility?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people don't understand, the court process. I mean, I think they see the state constitution, they see that protection that's written very explicitly in it, and that's the end of the story for them. And they don't understand the relationship between the states and the federal government, between state law and federal law, and that's what Judge Rhodes was trying to explain, is that our system of government, with the supremacy clause, says that federal law holds sway in federal court. It is disappointing. I think the fear that they have is real and justified. But again, I believe very strongly not only in federal law but also in our state constitution to be able to provide for fulfillment of those obligations, and I suspect that's the way it's going to come down.
Well, and Judge Rhodes said to the city, warn them, tread lightly, that he's not going to sign off on any kind of agreement that totally guts the pensions. What do you think that retirees can expect? What do you think the negotiation is going to start to be, Nolan?
Well, I think
if you could be a fly on the negotiation wall.
I think there's a lot of things going on right now in an effort to mitigate the impact on pensions. I mean, everybody understands these folks live on these pensions, and for a lot of them, it's their only source of income. And these are real people who will suffer real consequences if the pensions are wiped away. I suspect there'll be some pension reductions for both current and future retirees. I think the bigger hit will come in health care. That's a $6 billion unfunded liability for the city. I think they'll get dumped onto the Obamacare exchanges, and that's going to cost them money too. I do think the retirees are going to pay the heavier price here, and I think Judge Jerry Rosen, who's trying to work with the foundations to come up with a way to leverage DIA art to both protect the art from sale and save the pensions, we ought to be paying a lot of attention to those efforts and encouraging the foundations to engage here and make it happen.
All right, so let's dive into that conversation about the assets of the DIA. New reports are coming out just this week that there might be a deal in place with foundations looking at about $200 million. Originally, we had talked about $5.
I think that's still where it needs to be.
Is that still where you think it needs to be? But the conversations are around too?
Yeah, I think first of all, the foundations, everyone thinks, well, they're foundations, they just have money.
Yeah.
Give it to us. Well, it doesn't really work that way. They all have boards. They all have missions.
They all have mission statements about what their foundations, what they want to give for, and what they're.
They don't just write checks, and so the effort is to try to reconcile those missions and the missions of their board, the expectations of their boards, with something like this, which is completely unprecedented. I mean, I can't think of any other situation in which the nonprofit community, the philanthropic community, has been asked essentially to come in and make good on bad debts.
And it's a pass-through, too. I mean, it's not like you're asking people, give this money for an endowment that will, sort of support this institution ongoing. What you're asking for them is give this money for an endowment that will support pensions, so that it keeps the wolf away from your door over here.
Okay, so let me ask you, explain exactly how this would work.
I don't think anyone knows.
We don't know yet. But what they're looking at, what Rosen's been looking at for weeks now, is a way to use the art to raise, without selling it, to raise enough money to offset what they're going to need from the pensions. And basically what it would be a fund where people would either lease the art and give it back, or buy the art and give it back to the institution, buy the art museum from the city and put it into a nonprofit. There's a lot of different ideas being floated around, but basically they're trying to get local and national foundations to come up with the money to protect the DIA.
You know, I'm reminded I was reminded this week when people started really talking about this, about something that Kevin Orr said very early in this process, when the art first came up. He said, you know, he was very sensitive to the idea that, you know, people here value that, they value the museum, they don't want to see it close or the art go away. But he said, you know, Detroit has essentially hawked everything in that museum 6 times over about 40 years. Essentially now what we're trying to do is get it out of hock, and it's a really innovative idea to say to the foundations, essentially, take us to the pawn shop.
Yeah, come in and help us out.
Get it out for
But
us.
it can't just be Judge Rosen and the foundations working this out. The DIA has been dragging its feet, it's been very reluctant to engage in these talks, been very reluctant to put forth solutions. They've had their head up in their sand, trying to pretend, you know, you can't touch our art. Kevin Orr said to us the other day, he said, I'm done with them. He said, that's our art, that's our asset,
it's an
and we're going to come up with a solution here.
It's an interesting
That's
position.
got to be a
given
difficult
that
position.
Kevin has never met with any official at the museum.
Why not?
That's a great question.
Well, he claims he's tried
not
to.
met with any of them.
He claims that he has sent his folks over there.
He sent his folks over there, and all they've done is demand money.
But
Would it be a little?
You've got
Would it be a
the
little?
DIA sending out press releases to say this solution won't work, that solution won't work.
I mean,
Would it be a
nothing will
little
work, but
different
here's
though
nothing
if
will
he
work,
went
but not
himself
touching us.
as
But
opposed to sending people? Would it be different if he said
got to have
face
somebody
face
to meet
meeting?
with.
Well, but here's the issue. If you sell a single piece of art out of that museum, the first thing you do is you void the millages that they worked hard to get last year, which essentially closes the museum. So selling one piece of art is tantamount to selling it all, as a practical matter.
And the judge did
hurdle.
say in the ruling this week, he cautioned that would be just a temporary solution.
That's right. So that's what the ask was, right? Get this $500 million, and the only way to raise that kind of money really is a sale. So the museum's been pushed into a corner by the negotiators and unable to get to Kevin to say, hey, that's not going to work. What else might?
Okay, so Christie's has been appraising the art, and it just came out this week. They're looking at about a range of 400 to 800 million.
Yeah.
Did that come in low to you?
Yeah, a billion, or million. Yeah, I think they lowballed that. I think that's going to cause a problem for them. I think the creditors are going to say.
Creditors will want their own appraisal?
Want their own appraisal.
here's the.
I mean, if you've got one painting selling for that in auctions, for God's sake.
I thought the number shocked me too. But if you think of it this way, what they're looking at is what would happen if you put all this stuff out there together. Essentially, you would glut the market. I mean, there isn't unlimited interest or money
to buy art
this
of
stuff.
that
so
caliber.
If you sold these pieces, 50 pieces out of the museum, you would reduce their market value significantly by the virtue of doing it that way. And I think that has something to do with the number.
All right, so these conversations are ongoing, and we'll be watching that. I want to talk a little bit about the unions right now. We already have AFSCME filed their appeal to the ruling, but all of these folks are going to have to sit down with Kevin Orr and negotiate. What is that relationship going to be like going forward? And Kevin Orr said now's the time for the heavy lifting, really, and the intense negotiations.
Well, certainly now's the time to get it done. I mean, if they come in now and get a deal done that they sign off on, they're going to be in a lot better shape than if they wait and have something entered into the court here that they're not so crazy about. I mean, they could lose everything in this process.
Do you think they're going to wait and fight?
I don't think it will end up being a fight because you can't just sell stuff out of the museum. I mean, and Kevin doesn't want to be the person who ruined the DIA. I mean, think about what that would look like.
Well, nobody's talking about ruining the DIA. They're talking about coming up with creative solutions, and that's one of the points I make is that the museum needs to be part of this, and they need to get over this idea that they can avoid being part of this, as do the unions. I mean, the unions have drugged their feet in terms of negotiating. They're counting on being rescued somehow by another court, They keep filing lawsuits, motions. This thing's now going to go to the Sixth Circuit, where I suspect Judge Rhodes' ruling is going to be upheld. He's a good judge. He made a very careful ruling. This thing's going to go down to Cincinnati. It's going to come back here, and the union's going to be faced with the reality here that you got to make a deal.
Everyone,
and
but that's
been
not
very
just,
frustrated about this inability to get the unions to come to any sort of understanding that bankruptcy is a whole different environment.
Yeah, well, and that's, I mean, the ink's not dry on this opinion yet, and when it does dry, and when the Sixth Circuit says, you know, that it's fine, you're going to see an attitude change among all of the creditors, because again, Chapter 9 is structured in a way that gives the city tremendous advantage over the people that it owes, and striking a deal, cutting deals, is going to become the sort of primary motivation for everybody. That's the banks, that's the pensioners, that's going to be
and there's some key things that have to happen here. This arrangement to untangle the swap deal that Kwame Kilpatrick made and free up, make sure that casino money is free. That's going to be key to the ability of Kevin Orr and Mike Duggan to continue restructuring services and trying to upgrade services.
And that leads to the last part of this big picture is getting the money and making sure now you have that money that you can infuse back into the city and the city services. Kevin Orr says we're going to start to see improvements with blight and with the lighting grid in the next year or so. That's the biggest places that people will start to see a change.
Well, I mean, we need to see that change. We needed to see that change before now, quite frankly. If you go back to when Kevin Orr got here, he was talking about 30, 60, 90 days before he said, you know, people would start to notice a difference. Well, the story's changed, and that happens to everybody who comes to Detroit and says, oh, you know, I can fix this very quickly. These are complex problems, and they don't have easy solutions. They don't have cheap solutions. He's moving things, I think, into place that will pay big dividends for Detroiters down the road. I would caution him against promising quick results anymore, because there aren't easy solutions. The lighting problem is unbelievably complex.
But he's got to do something today, immediately, about police response times. And they keep bragging up the fact, oh, we're doing better, we're cutting crime in the downtown area. So a Time photographer in town last night shooting pictures, a very well-known photographer shooting pictures for the magazine. His whole of his camera equipment, his cell phone, everything got stolen. He used the tracker, trace it back to a house in Detroit, called police and said, I'm standing in front of the house. I could getting the signal from my cell phone. I know where it's at. And police said, well, we don't come out on those kind of calls. You cannot have people calling the police for any kind of crime, theft, whether it's theft or violence, and having the police say, we don't respond.
Well, and it's things like that keep the national stories alive.
That's the problem. But and it's really unfortunate that happened to this guy who's a visitor. But the truth is, Detroiters have that experience every day.
And that's what I'm saying.
Police,
people are not going to stay. They're not going to wait.
Right. You cannot get police to respond to crime unless it's emergent. I mean, this is a police department that runs from emergency to emergency without doing the kind of crime prevention that we need, without responding to the kinds of quality of life issues that keep people in neighborhoods. You're starting to see big splash kind of things that Chief Craig is doing, but you are really turning a freighter around 180 degrees. That also is going to take time. You're not going to see.
It remains to be seen how much time people are going to give it, and if people don't want to move into the city, and then you need your tax revenue, and it's just all a big circle.
Cycle.
And your neighbor gets broke into, and that you start thinking about, maybe I should leave. The neighbors think maybe I should leave. It becomes, it builds on itself.
And it's a massive story that, of course, that we are going to continue to follow. Gentlemen, thank you so much. And that is going to do it for My Week. Thanks so much for watching. Head to MiWeek.org for any shows that you might have missed, plus Nolan and Stephen's columns from the week. Find us on Facebook and Twitter. That way you can get your My Week fix, before next Thursday night. I'm Christy McDonald. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.